911, where's your emergency?
Hello, yes, ma'am. I was passing through Winship Street, and I seen a guy laying in the middle of the road next to with an umbrella. I didn't stop because it's like in a very dark little path.
Do you know if this was a white male or a black male?
It's a black male.
And he had an umbrella next to him?
Yeah, it was an umbrella next to him. It's very dark out here, but he was just laying in the middle of the street because it's like right here by a cemetery. So I didn't want to stop.
Sheriff's officers respond to the call.
When I got the call, I activated my body camera. It initially came in as a black male lying in the street. When I arrived, it was dark, it was raining, very low visibility, so the circumstances themselves just made it seem a little more suspicious. It was very freaky, especially being that close to the cemetery.
Dispatch, maybe a 42.
I was able to tell that the person that we initially thought was a male was actually a female. My thought was this person was either intoxicated and laying out, or this person was struck by a vehicle.
Hey, can you hear me?
She was lying on her back, her eyes were open, and the rain was hitting her eyes, and she wasn't blinking. I could see blood on her legs a little bit.
482, I'm gonna need you en route to Pinona Lane in Winship Street.
I called for an ambulance, and I checked for her pulse. I was able to confirm she was deceased. As I looked closer, I realized her injury to the leg was actually a gunshot.
Hey, 3 or 7, one of y'all head this way. We're gonna need to set this up as a crime scene.
I called for backup immediately after that because I was pretty sure it was now a homicide investigation. As I'm looking at the scene, I didn't know whether she was dumped there or whether she had indeed been murdered at that location. I realized this would be a mystery.
Dispatch, clip 43 en route.
Tempo, thank you.
The location where the victim was found is very isolated. I'd found 2 shell casings there. Both shell casings were located in the roadway, one close to her and one a little further away. One of the things that kind of alarmed me was the fact that her body was still warm. I felt as if the suspect could have still been in the area, probably watching me. So the danger was heightened.
Emergency responders soon arrive on the scene.
It's gonna be a signal 11. No pulse. 2 gunshot wounds. I haven't opened her jacket yet. There's one to the leg, shell casings. Yeah, it's gonna be a female.
When EMS arrived, I had advised them that the victim I thought was deceased. It did not make sense. It was weird for her to have been shot there. At the time, I had no idea what could have happened to her, what transpired.
Is that a GSW right there? It's kind of big.
EMS zipped her jacket, and at that point, I could see more blood, and we were able to see a second projectile wound near her neck area.
That too. There you go.
There it is.
There's another one there.
It really kind of hits home when you see someone like that you connect to. She's probably my mom's age, or she's someone's mom, and it does make you angry that someone would be that violent towards someone.
It's like another one right there.
So somebody dressed her. Yeah, somebody put that on her.
Honestly, I can't think of why somebody would shoot her in the neck and then cover her
Cover it
back
up, yeah.
With the jacket being zipped up, it almost seemed to indicate that they don't want to see what they did. It was almost as if maybe someone was angry at her, and this was maybe someone that she knew.
She's smoking, man. You see the steam coming off of her? She's not been here long. I don't know why they would do it either.
Whoever wanted this poor lady dead was targeting her and picked her out.
Detectives arrive and scour the scene for clues.
Gunshot wound to the neck. There's 2 shell cases up there.
I see the one right there.
40 caliber round. All right.
When I showed up to the scene, it was pouring down rain, actually. We had an unidentified middle-aged female gunned down for no reason in the middle of the street and left for dead right next to a cemetery. It just kind of made the whole scene much more macabre. We didn't really know a whole lot at the time.
Passerby called. When I pulled up, she was laying like this. Any ID?
The officers working the crime scene that night found her wallet with her identification, and we were able to identify the victim as Ida M. Ford.
Ida's loved ones soon learn of her murder.
Well, I was in shock when I heard about Ida's demise. What were the circumstances? It was the kind of situation that really didn't make any sense. We just didn't know what to say, what to do, and all we could do was try to console the legacy that she had left behind and her family. Ida was a very inquisitive person about the Word of God. She liked to come to Bible study, and she would like to really get to the core and try to understand what the Word of God was saying. We wondered, even to this day, why did this happen? How did Ida wind up being the victim in this situation?
Officers continue to process the crime scene.
The jacket was zipped up, but the entry wound was right there where you can see that. She got cash in her pocket. Okay.
Deputies at the scene noticed that she still had cash in her pocket, along with a cell phone that was lying next to her. We knew that we weren't dealing with a robbery, but we knew that we had to act fast and find out who the killer was.
I haven't walked yet.
Miss Ford lived very close to the crime scene where her body was found, within walking distance.
The big mystery was what lured her outside. Where was she going? Was she going to meet someone?
Sheriff's office.
Deputies begin canvassing the area for potential witnesses.
Hey, how you doing? Hey, well, we just had a lady shot over here. She got shot left right there at Pine Under Lane.
20 minutes ago.
So you heard the gunshot?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you look outside to see anything or anything like that?
It's so common, I didn't look at it.
The neighborhood where Miss Ford lived is known for a higher crime area than some of the other neighborhoods within the city. It would not be unusual for anyone living in that neighborhood to hear gunfire at all hours of the night, or even during the day for that matter.
Your car drive off anything?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Dang it.
Too much death. I don't know, investigator may come over here and talk to you shortly.
That neighbor couldn't tell me anything else. Hearing gunshots in that area is fairly common, and it is frustrating when they hear things and they just don't say anything.
Somebody drove by and saw her, but they left her laying in the ground, in the grass, on the concrete. So we'll probably be out here a while. We got to go back over here and work this crime scene.
I was pretty sure at that point, with that witness hearing the gunshots, that she was murdered in the streets of Macon. This crime, it seems so much more personal to me. And the location she was gunned down, it makes your head spin. Like, why?
2 shots about 20 minutes ago. Man, I'm so tired of it, man.
You and me both. All right. Thank you, sir.
In 20 minutes, a person on foot can travel a great distance and even further in a car. In 20 minutes, our shooter could be outside of Macon.
The majority of the homicides that we usually work are involving either gang members, drug deals gone bad. We knew with the case with Miss Ford that this was not the normal type of homicide that we usually work.
At the beginning of this case, it was a complete mystery as to why Miss Ford had ended up in a cemetery on a cold, rainy night without any initial lead. So we had to figure out why she ended up where she was and what she had been doing that night. It was a complete and utter enigma as to what had happened.
Hoping to learn why Ida may have been outside that night, detectives search her home, located nearby.
When we first showed up to the house, we noticed the house was secure, it was locked, and we really wasn't sure what we would find. We were hoping for any type of clues, because at the moment we had nothing. We went inside, there was no one there, house was empty, TV was still playing, she was watching the Georgia-Alabama game. It didn't appear that there was any type of struggle. Everything inside the house looked as it would probably normally be.
The night of this murder was the University of Georgia playing the University of Alabama in Atlanta for the national championship. It was the most important thing happening in this state. Everybody was watching the game. While detectives are searching the house, we were able to recover Miss Ford's phone and able to start looking into who she had had last contact with. And we were able to determine that the last number she spoke to belonged to someone named Fred Thompson, approximately 1 hour before she was murdered.
We simply just called the number, and Mr. Thompson immediately hung the phone up, did not want to speak to us. It was making him look like a very good suspect. We looked into his criminal history, and we were able to find that he had previous charges against him. With the assistance of our gang task force and the U.S. Marshal Service, they were able to locate Fred Thompson's address.
I made the decision to bring everybody in to try and help solve the murder of Miss Ford. We began to use all resources available in the Bibb County Sheriff's Office. So we began to contact not only the Major Crimes Unit, but we began to talk to our Violent Crime Gang Task Force, and we also contacted the Fugitive Task Force. We're trying to get as much resources to follow down leads, look for additional evidence, talk to additional witnesses to help solve this murder.
Surveillance was conducted around 5 o'clock the following day. Fred Thompson was observed by the Fugitive Task Force pulling up to his house and as exiting his car, at which time the Fugitive Task Force made contact with him.
Detectives bring Fred into the station for questioning.
During the interview, we wanted to establish Fred Thompson did have a relationship with Miss Ford. And then we also wanted to see where he would have been that night, whether he had any alibis.
How long y'all been Maybe about a month ago. About a month, maybe a month. How'd y'all meet? I met her by Montpelier. I know about it this season.
Mr. Thompson did in fact know Miss Ford. They were currently boyfriend-girlfriend at the time of her murder. We needed to determine, was there in fact a reason that Mr. Thompson would want harm?
How's that relationship been so far? Good. You had any problems or anything? No problem.
Fred Thompson was very straightforward, very deliberate. He didn't show any signs of nervousness. It can be an indicator that they're possibly hiding something. I asked Fred, could he give us some type of information that could prove that he was not involved in the murder of Ida Ford?
Supposed to go by that bad night. so I wasn't going to come because I wanted to watch the Georgia-Alabama game. And she's like, you can come and watch it, but I've been asleep as long as you don't wake me up. So, it started raining and stuff, so I didn't come because I don't have a car or nothing like that, so I just didn't go.
Mr. Thompson's alibi of watching the game, that was a reasonable thing for him to be doing at the time of the murder. But there's going to be numerous commercial breaks and halftime and interviews, so it is possible for somebody to have slipped out, especially at the time of Miss Ford's death.
What time did you find out that this had happened to Ida?
This girl down the street called on the phone, and she said, when the last time I talked to my friend, because they found somebody in the middle of the road, I told her I could talk to her earlier, but let me call her and, see what she okay and everything. So I called and the phone kept going to the answer machine. I called her probably about 5 or 6 times, but nobody never answered the phone. Well, that made it start, kind of worried a little bit.
He denied having any involvement in Ida's murder whatsoever. We asked him if he knew anybody who may have had some type of involvement in the homicide.
Whoever her ex is, you might be talking to that guy.
Fred stated that he thought that there may be someone who may have been involved in the murder of Ida, but at the time wasn't able to give us a name.
She's afraid of him, or what did
we cut her on the phone. She was telling me he had stopped by and he was talking about what he'll do to her, and she said been together about 10 years and jump on her all the time and stuff. She's like 10 years of being beaten or bruised and stuff, and she said she couldn't deal with it no more.
When you're investigating a murder and you hear about allegations of domestic abuse, obviously your dander goes up.
I don't know, I just got a bad idea about it because y'all always call me my crazy ex.
But detectives can't be sure Fred isn't trying to divert attention away from himself.
Well, a lot of times someone may try and give you a name of somebody to kind of lead you down the wrong rabbit hole during an investigation. The guilty party may try and steer you in a different direction. One of the normal techniques that we use in investigations, we get our suspect's cell phone and we try and extract data from that could show us the locations of where they were during certain times. So Fred would stay a suspect until we were able to eliminate him.
While they wait for the results, detectives set out to identify Ida's ex-boyfriend.
Based on the information that Fred gave to us, we went to Ida's place of work, spoke with a Joe Johnson. He was able to give the name of a Charles Smith as being the ex-boyfriend of her. He was able to give us some information that made the hairs on the back of our neck stand up.
When she was killed, we all thought Charles had done it because they had such a volatile relationship. Ida would express fear of Charles, and she would be afraid of what he might do. A few years before Ida's death, we helped Ida get a restraining order against Charles and actually helped move her out. The police told him not to go within 200 feet of her.
Now that we had the name of Charles Smith, Ida's ex-boyfriend, and we were able to confirm the fact that he was dangerous and a possible suspect in the murder of Ida, we knew that we had to work quickly in getting him off the streets. We had a potential violent murderer on the loose. We already knew that Charles Smith had a violent history. Due to running a criminal history check on him, we needed to try and see what type of motive that Charles would have had in killing Ida. Investigators were able to locate him at his residence at around 5 a.m. in the morning and brought him to the Detective Bureau.
When Mr. Smith was interviewed, he did confirm that he had been in a relationship with Miss Ford prior.
about 6-7 years.
How long were you and her together?
About 5 years.
I brought up the fact of their violent relationship in the past, and he abruptly denied any type of violence toward her whatsoever.
I ain't done there once, man. They already got no damn credit. They're going down.
But you do know Ida Bolton?
I know I told.
Okay. Unfortunately, Ida has passed away.
Did she?
Yes, she is.
Somebody killed her?
Yes, it was not speak out natural causes. Someone who actually has taken her life. Well, we're not sure yet. We've got to wait on the autopsy stuff to be done, but that's why I'm trying to hunt you down and speak with you.
When I informed Charles Smith that Ida had been, in fact, murdered, he immediately seemed shocked.
Do you have any idea who would want to do this to her?
You know, I didn't know Ida had any outside contact.
I already knew that he was being untruthful about the previous domestic violence between him and Ida, and so I didn't know at the time whether he could be eliminated as a suspect or not.
Detectives pressed Charles on his whereabouts on the night of Ida's murder.
Charles, like Fred, also lived a few miles away from Ida's address.
Mr. Smith, like everybody else, had his eyes glued to the TV and was watching the national championship game between Georgia and Alabama. And he told us that he was there with his current girlfriend and that they had watched the first half and then they had gone to bed.
I knew it had to be important. It had to be something important for y'all to come over my house at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, I didn't want to do it there at your house. I wanted to do it here. Okay.
We had no other evidence, anything linking him to Ida's murder, and at that time we had no other choice but to release Charles Smith. But the first thing that I knew that needed to be done was we needed to make contact with this girlfriend to confirm Charles's story. We didn't know if this could be possibly a retaliation against anything that had happened in he and Ida's previous relationship.
As the investigation unfolds, her friends grieve.
Ida really reserved in her heart the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," because we've talked about that on occasion. And of course, she knew that the Word of God was something that meant a lot to her, and that 23rd Psalms is something that I really think kind of underscored her life.
Ida had never met a stranger. She would find a common ground to talk about with anybody. She would just draw you in. You just couldn't help but like her. She was so sweet. If you were one of Ida's people, nobody better mess with you. She was almost like a hen protecting her eggs.
Detectives next set out to confirm Charles's whereabouts at the time of the murder and speak with his girlfriend.
Can you give me a breakdown of the timeline of yesterday? Like where you were and where he was?
I stay home. I don't go nowhere.
Okay.
So I'm there all day. He gets up in the morning about, I'll say before it gets daylight, and he goes to work. He had a lot of stuff to do yesterday, so he didn't get home until about going on 5 o'clock.
Okay.
When you're interviewing someone, it's kind of like playing poker. So you don't want to show your hand necessarily. You don't want them to know what you know or what you may not know. So you want to kind of you want to let them open up the door and kind of let them actually sometimes incriminate themselves.
He normally just get in, he just take a bath or whatever, and so he have to wind down. And so about 7, I came in there with him.
And we're
in the bedroom. We got a separate bedroom. So I came in there with him or whatever, and I laid with him probably to the first half of the game, and then he
sat in the living room, and I went to my bedroom.
How you say when you go get something?
She didn't leave the house.
Okay.
But the time frame that the girlfriend gave actually was able to confirm that Charles would have been able to sneak away, commit the murder of Ida Ford. I actually asked her, had Charles been violent to her? She seemed shocked.
What about physical? He put his hands on you. Yep. Okay. You know, the issue that you guys have had, it's never been a physical. No, never threatening.
A lot of times, your domestic violence victims will lie due to fear or fear from retaliation from the other party. So it's not unusual for someone to deny any type of domestic abuse.
We found 40 caliber shell casings by Miss Ford's body at the crime scene. So the detectives asked Mr. Smith's girlfriend if he in fact owned a firearm, and if he did, was it a .40 caliber?
How did he go? Not that I know of. Not that I know of. Because I told him that's what my brother had when we first met. I hate guns.
After speaking with the girlfriend, we had no evidence linking Charles to the murder of Ida Mae Ford, and at this point, we were pretty much swinging in the dark. We just were coming up short, and we were frustrated. Out of all the individuals interviewed in this case, every one of them had the same alibi. They were watching the Georgia-Alabama game. What I began doing was looking at any type of incidents that may have happened prior to Ida's murder, anything that may pop up on the radar as a reason of why this happened.
The reality is you don't get to pick and choose your evidence, and you don't get to pick and choose your witnesses. It's not TV. It's not like you see on TV where they're magically witnesses and there's only one case to work and witnesses come forward in an aha moment. This is the real world, and you're dealt with the evidence you have. And sometimes you have a lot of evidence and sometimes you don't.
Mercer University students are shaken up after shots were fired on campus last night. 4 students and a recent graduate say a man fired 6 shots at them.
As we're investigating this forward, we hear about the shooting at 4 university students, and alarm bells are going off in my head that perhaps these two are linked because Miss Ford lived near the campus.
Detectives raced to Mercer University.
Detectives made contact with the students. There were 4 of them, and they gave an account, and their stories were all the same, that they had been walking down the street when they observed somebody appear from out of the darkness and fire 4 shots at them. They, of course, were in fear for their lives and took off running. Nobody was able to get a good look, but they were all convinced that it was 4 shots. We began to canvass the area, and at the location we found shell casings, and they are .40 caliber shell casings, which again gets our dander up because those are the same caliber as was found at Miss Ford's crime scene. So we're beginning to think perhaps there may be a link between the 2 events. We have a lot of missing pieces in both of these investigations. So we're trying to see if there's any of the pieces that may fit to help solve the overall puzzle. Were these 2 crimes linked?
Detectives tracked down suspects Fred and Charles and confirmed their alibis at the time of the shooting.
We really wasn't sure what was going on. We had to brace for possibly more violence.
It's then detectives receive word of a potentially major break in the case.
I had heard over the radio a deputy had conducted a traffic stop, had located inside a vehicle that belonged to a Kyle Henderson, a bag containing about 1 pound of marijuana, and located a .40 caliber handgun as well. Type of caliber that was used in Ida's murder as well as the shooting at Mercer University.
Mr. Henderson was arrested for having a weapon without a license and for the marijuana, and his gun was seized. And we sent that weapon off for ballistics testing at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to see if it would ballistically match the shell casings at either Miss Ford's murder scene, the Mercer University shooting, or both.
A criminal history was conducted on Kyle, and the fact that he was a convicted felon made him a suspect in the murder The deputy brought Kyle down to the detective bureau, at which time he was taken into an interview room. I wanted to speak with him to, see, where he would have been the night of the murder.
We'll talk about yourself, okay? All right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about Monday.
All right. Which is, I be out every day. I mean, every Monday. They know that all night Monday. No, true.
And you brought you're the one in the trip.
I was at this time.
Right, Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle was very uncooperative, acted very agitated. He most certainly let us know that he did not want to be there. But we also let Kyle know that we were serious and we wanted to get down to the bottom of whether he had any type of involvement with the murder or not.
I told you, I'd take my daughter to school. Tell me again. Tell me again. You like to move now. And like I tell you, I told you, I take my daughter to school at 8 o'clock every morning. And then I leave my girlfriend by 12 when she go to work.
Cal seemed to think that we were kind of acting like we were in some kind of show or some kind of movie, like this thing was a big joke. We certainly let him know that this was no movie and this was real life.
I'm talking about every morning.
Yeah, well, Monday, you see the thing? Monday, I took my daughter to school. Boom, $12. I came back home. I got there about 8:30, 9 o'clock. I laid down about 11:30. When my girlfriend went to Baltimore time, then I went to T-Man house. What I'm telling you about. I left this time about 8 or 9 o'clock. Then I went home to her, and she didn't tell you that.
We were dealing with the murder of an innocent mother and grandmother, and he was getting cocky, and so we turned the heat up on him.
It's round the corner. I'm asking you, you have in the car with you, okay? You get what I'm saying now? You got another in the car with you. You were by yourself. Which one?
I rolled by myself to my brother's house, and I rolled back from my brother's house with myself.
I just outright asked Kyle if he had any involvement in the murder. He denied any involvement in the murder and also denied even knowing who Ida was. I was a little reluctant to believe that he, didn't have any involvement in it. We started to dig into the reason why he had a gun on him.
Well, the gun is .40 caliber, okay? Now, I want to let you know that we're working a murder, okay? That the same type of weapon was used in. And you just so happen to get picked up today with what? Same type of weapon, right? So, how do you think that looks? What about me? A stone? You both do it together. No, I mean, okay. Where's your girlfriend living? Call. She didn't tell you I did. She was calling the phone anyway. She want to know where I'm at.
After years of interviewing people, you start to get a sense of when someone is not being truthful. I was still unsure whether he had anything to do with Ida's murder, but there really wasn't a whole lot else outside of the gun that was pointing him to her murder.
Okay. This gun got fire. Who you think is coming in? Now me? You want like that? You got good, right? You want that? Most probably you all with us being straight up. I mean, issues you don't have because that's good on there. Straight up with me. Okay. I'm coming back at you. Wait till you got man.
Even though Kyle was, irrational, was angry, frustrated about, us asking the questions if he was involved in a murder, he still willingly gave over a sample of his DNA. Until we were able to get any other evidence, Kyle would stay a suspect.
We're investigating the violent death of Miss Ford, an attack on several students at Mercer University. We were not going to leave any stone unturned, but we had no idea of the curveball we were about to be thrown.
Until we were able to get any other evidence or results back from the shell casing sent off to the GBI, Kyle would stay a suspect until we were able to eliminate him.
But 10 days later, detectives receive a call from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation that threatens to send the investigation in an entirely new direction.
I spoke with one of the GBI agents. He stated that he had a Quentin Sanders in custody down in Macon County, which is a few counties south of here. Quentin stated that he had killed a woman in Bibb County. I didn't know at the time if it had anything to do with Ida Mae Ford, but we knew that we certainly did want to speak with him. So myself, along with 2 other investigators, went down to Macon County.
Quentin Sanders was a name that had not come up in the investigation. We had no information about Mr. Sanders. We had not developed any lead of him. He had turned himself in not only with regard to the murder, but he had turned in a .40 caliber pistol. So we were quite interested in hearing what he had to say.
We dug into the background of Quentin Sanders. He had some petty crimes on his record, but nothing connecting Quentin to Ida Mae Ford. But I also found out that Quentin was not very mentally stable. The first thing that I thought was maybe this was someone who had come in and confessed to something that he hadn't done, which has happened before in the past.
Detectives sit down with Quentin.
We knew that we really needed to approach him with kid gloves. If not, we figured that he would probably shut down.
They start by asking him about the Mercer shooting.
The college kids, tell me how that went down. The group of kids.
It was like, if you don't do this, you're gonna continue to be stuck. And like I said, I didn't rob them, but it just kept telling me I gotta do it. And I just saw the kids and I just started shooting.
He then gave us further details with regard to the shooting of the Mercer University students. He described in perfect detail where he had been and where the students were and where he had appeared and where he had shot at them, how many shots he had fired, and where the students ran that lined up with the accounts of the students. His confession sent chills up my spine.
And where were you at in that little area before they came around, the kids?
I was sitting right here on a bench, right here, and it's like some bushes in these buildings. There's a camera right there. And I jumped up and I just shot, and I ran to the side of some apartments, and I jumped in the woods.
After hearing some of the things that Quentin stated, we knew we had the right guy.
Detectives then begin questioning Quentin about the murder of Ida Mae Ford.
And I don't want to be around the bush. We were informed about a homicide of a lady in Macon that happened a few weeks back. What can you tell me about that?
I saw a lady walking, and I saw she was walking. She asked me where I was going. She said she was going one way. I said I was going another way.
Can you tell me a little bit about, you said it was on Madden.
It was a graveyard here, Madden Avenue here, and she walked from a house right here.
One of the things I noticed about Quentin was that he showed a complete lack of empathy at all. It was as if you were staring in the eyes of the devil himself. You saw her leave her house?
Well, I saw her coming from that direction.
Okay. Can you describe it?
I just know it was on the right side of the road.
Okay.
I kind of stopped and waited till she caught up to me, and we had those few words, and I shot her.
Mr. Sanders detailed how he had met Ida Mae Ford walking down the street, and he had talked to her. He would describe the night, that it was cold and it was raining, it was dark. He described in perfect detail where he had fired the shots and how many shots he had fired. He knew exactly where he had committed this heinous act. So these are details we had already knew. Mr. Sanders was asked why he had decided to turn himself in, and he told the investigators it was the guilt and the shame of his crimes that caused him to turn himself in. We want to make sure that we do, in fact, have a true confession. So we retrieved the .40 caliber and we sent it off to the GBI. Not only did the ballistics positively link Quentin Sanders to the murder of Ida Mae Ford and the shooting of the Mercer University students, it completely exonerated Fred Thompson, Charles Smith, and Kyle Henderson of any involvement.
Based on the overwhelming evidence and the confession of Quentin Sanders, I believe that his reign of terror started on January the 8th, 2018. Ida Mae Ford left her house to go to the store in the pouring down rain. She was walking toward him, and as they got close to the cemetery, and he pulled out the handgun and shot her. 2 days later, his crime spree continued when he fired multiple rounds at Mercer University students.
On August 24th, 2018, Quentin Sanders pleads guilty to the felony murder of Ida Mae Ford and 4 counts of aggravated assault for the Mercer shootings. He is sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years.
In all the years that I've worked homicides, one of the one word that I hate the most is closure. You already have a human life that's been taken. There's no type of closure that you can give to that victim's family. Ida Mae Ford's murder was one of the most senseless murders I've worked in my entire career. The life of an innocent person was taken for absolutely 100% no reason.
I've been a prosecutor for 22 years and I've handled a lot of cases, but Quentin Sanders is one of those monsters that will haunt your dreams and will keep you awake at night. I can never bring Ida Ford back to her family, but I can go to bed at night and put my head on my pillow, knowing that through the hard work of law enforcement agencies and the hard work of the district attorney's office, we were able to bring the monster that took Ida Mae Ford from her family and put him away for the rest of his life.
When a person leaves this world under such tragic conditions, they are not forgotten. People want to keep that constantly at the forefront of their thinking or of their mind because of the pain that comes with it. Ida will not be forgotten. It is the Word of God that helps us to move on and know that because they believed in the Lord Jesus Christ, we will see them again.
I feel fortunate to have known Ida, to have worked with Ida. I think my life is better because I knew her. Just there's certain people that just make you feel better, and Ida was one of them. She made me feel better. She was always, if I had a scowl on my face, she would always try to find out what was going on and try to help. She was just a helper. She'll always be a part of me. She was just a lovely person, and I'm just sad that I won't see her face on this earth again.
At 2:17 a.m., the snow began to fall again, thin and quiet, turning the sidewalks of Upper Manhattan into a blank page no one had asked for, and somewhere between the last train and the first delivery truck. A scream cut through the dark and vanished just as quickly, swallowed by brick walls, closed windows, and the unspoken rule of the city that says you don't look unless you have to. By sunrise, New York would call it another bad night. By nightfall, the papers would use a different word. Cold case. The year was 1995, a year when the city was learning how to breathe again after decades of violence. When crime graphs were finally bending downward but fear still lived in the muscle memory of every block. On West 164th Street, the buildings were tired but upright, red brick stacked with stubborn pride, fire escapes clinging to their sides like metal ribs. This was not a place people imagined would become a headline. This was a place people passed through. That's why no one noticed when the lights on the third floor of number 417 stayed on all night, glowing weakly behind curtains that never moved. Inside that apartment, time had stopped. Her name would be printed the next day in small, careful type. 27 years old, recently promoted, known by friends as meticulous, reliable, the kind of person who returned borrowed books with handwritten notes tucked inside. She had lived alone for just 6 months, long enough to believe she was safe, short enough that the walls still smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. When the building superintendent unlocked the door after repeated complaints about water leaking into the unit below, he expected a burst pipe. What he found instead was silence so complete it felt deliberate. The scene was wrong in ways that took trained eyes to articulate. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. The apartment looked staged, not by a decorator, but by someone who understood restraint. The body lay near the bedroom doorway, positioned as if sleep had been interrupted mid-step. There were marks on the neck, faint but unmistakable. The medical examiner would later use the word manual, a word that carries the weight of intention. Strangulation requires proximity. It requires time. It requires a decision to keep going. By mid-morning, the street was taped off, blue and white fluttering in the wind. Neighbors leaning out of windows, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. Squad cars lined the curb. Detectives moved in and out of the building with the practiced economy of people who had seen too much. A young patrol officer stood at the corner, eyes scanning the crowd, wondering how many times the killer had already walked past him in life, unnoticed. The first questions came quickly. Who had been here last? Who had keys? Who had reason? Friends were called. Co-workers interviewed. An ex-boyfriend surfaced, then sank under the weight of an alibi that checked out too cleanly to ignore. There were no defensive wounds, no sexual assault, no abuse. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, cash still inside, jewelry untouched. The television was off, the radio silent. It was as if someone had come only to erase her from the room, not to take anything with them. The newspapers smelled blood. Young professional found dead in apartment. Quiet block, violent secret. And then the phrase that sticks because it sounds clinical, almost gentle. Investigators say the case is ongoing. That phrase buys time. Promises answers without specifying when they'll arrive. Detectives canvassed the building, knocking on doors, collecting half-memories. A woman on the 4th floor thought she heard footsteps around midnight, slow and heavy, but she had assumed it was the man downstairs who worked nights. A couple across the hall reported a brief argument earlier that week. Voices muffled, words lost to the wall. The superintendent mentioned a stranger he'd seen once in the lobby, waiting near the mailboxes, claiming to look for a friend who never came down. No one could describe his face, only his patience. In the days that followed, the apartment became a shrine of absence. Flowers gathered outside the door. Candles melted into waxy puddles on the stoop. Friends stood in small clusters, speaking in low voices, asking the same question again and again because they didn't know what else to do with it. Why her? Why here? Why like this? Inside the precinct, the evidence board filled slowly. Photographs, timelines, names written in marker and erased when they led nowhere. Phone records showed nothing unusual. No threatening messages. No late-night calls that stood out. Her routine was almost painfully ordinary. Work, gym, grocery store, home. A life built of habits which should have made it easier to trace the disruption, but instead made it harder to imagine where the danger had slipped in. Then came the first strange detail. A neighbor recalled seeing her in the lobby 2 nights before the murder, speaking with someone he did not recognize. Not a resident. Not a delivery worker. The conversation was brief, intense. Their bodies angled toward each other in a way that suggested familiarity, or at least urgency. When detectives asked him to describe the man, his answers collapsed into vagueness. Average height, dark jacket, nothing that would stand out in a city built on anonymity. Still, it was something. Something was better than nothing. Investigators traced her movements backward, hour by hour. The last confirmed sighting placed her at a corner bodega at 9:43 p.m., buying milk and a newspaper. The clerk remembered her because she always paid in exact change. That night, she smiled, wished him a good evening, and stepped back into the cold. The walk home would have taken less than 10 minutes. Somewhere in that short distance, or perhaps already inside her building, the story bent. As the weeks stretched on, pressure mounted. A young woman dead in her own apartment was not the kind of crime the city wanted to linger. The mayor's office called for updates. The press asked sharper questions. Detectives worked longer hours, chasing leads that dissolved under scrutiny. Every cold case begins warm with urgency and noise. The danger is not that people stop caring all at once, but that attention thins, spreads out, finds newer horrors to focus on. A potential suspect emerged briefly when a coworker mentioned an older man who had been seen waiting outside the office building more than once, claiming to be her uncle. He wasn't. Security footage was grainy, faces blurred into suggestion. By the time detectives tracked him down, the trail had cooled, and the man's explanation, while odd, was not criminal. Another name was erased from the board. The autopsy confirmed what the scene had suggested. Time of death estimated between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. No drugs in her system. No alcohol. She had been sober, aware, alive to the moment until the moment ended. There were faint abrasions on her wrists, not enough to signal a struggle, but enough to imply resistance. She had tried, at least briefly, to pull away. Weeks passed, then months. The blue tape came down. The candles burned out. The apartment was cleaned, repainted, rented again to someone who would never quite feel alone there, even in daylight. The case file thickened, then stalled. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away. Memories softened around the edges. The word ongoing quietly transformed into something heavier. Unsolved. By the end of the year, the investigation had narrowed to a handful of possibilities. None strong enough to hold. A stranger who had watched and waited. An acquaintance whose presence left no trace. Someone who knew how to enter without breaking, how to leave without being seen. The detectives involved would later say the same thing, independently, as if repeating a line they hadn't agreed on but all believed. This didn't feel random. This felt personal without being intimate. And then, almost imperceptibly, the case slipped into the long, dark corridor where files gathered dust and questions echo without answers. A cold case, the kind that sits on a shelf but never really leaves the building, haunting late nights and early mornings, resurfacing whenever a similar crime crossed a desk. Her name remained in the system, waiting for something new. A mistake, a confession, a piece of technology not yet invented. In 1995, no one could have predicted how long the silence would last, or how heavy it would become. No one could have known that decades later, a single test, a single match, would pull this night back into the light, forcing the city to look again at a snow-covered street and a third-floor apartment where time once stopped. For now, all New York knew was this. Someone had taken a life and disappeared into the crowd, and the city, loud and restless, carried on, unaware that the quietest stories are often the ones that refuse to stay buried. Silence does not arrive all at once. It seeps in, filling the gaps left behind when the phones stop ringing and the faces around the evidence board change. By the winter of 1996, the case had lost its edge in the precinct, not because it no longer mattered, but because nothing new had dared to surface. The file sat heavy in a metal drawer, its label already yellowing at the corners, while outside the city kept moving, learning new fears, forgetting old ones. For the detectives who had been there that first morning, the apartment on West 164th Street never truly faded. It followed them home, into dreams, into the quiet moments when the radio was off and the streets blurred past the windshield. The first re-examination came almost by accident. A young detective, newly assigned, was tasked with digitizing old reports, feeding the past into machines that promised order. He read the statements without the exhaustion of lived memory, without the dulling effect of months of failure. To him, every line was sharp again. Every omission stood out. He noticed how often the phrase "no sign of forced entry" appeared, repeated like a fact beyond challenge. and he wondered quietly why that conclusion had been reached so quickly. Doors can be opened without breaking. Trust is the cleanest key there is. He pulled the photographs, grainy and overexposed, and stared at the front door, the lock, the frame. Nothing obvious. Still, the thought lingered. The victim had been careful. She locked up. Friends said so. She double-checked. If someone walked in uninvited, she either let them or she never had the chance to resist. Both possibilities narrowed the field, and yet both widened it too. The second strange detail emerged in the form of a receipt. Buried in the back of the file, overlooked because it seemed mundane, was a slip of thermal paper from a hardware store 3 blocks away, time-stamped 2 days before the murder. The items listed were ordinary: light bulbs, batteries, duct tape. The tape had raised an eyebrow at the time, then been dismissed. Plenty of people buy tape. What mattered now was that no roll had been found in the apartment. It was not a smoking gun. It was barely smoke. But it suggested movement, intention, a preparation that did not fit the narrative of a sudden, spontaneous act. Detectives retraced her steps again, years too late to catch the same details, but not too late to ask new questions. The hardware store owner remembered her vaguely, remembered more clearly the man who had been with her, because he had lingered, asking about adhesives, about strength and flexibility. The owner had assumed they were a couple. When asked to describe him, the answer was familiar in its uselessness. Average. Unremarkable. The kind of man who becomes invisible the moment he steps outside. That memory shifted the angle. Investigators revisited the idea that the killer had been someone known, at least casually, someone who could stand beside her in a store without raising alarms. They looked again at her social circle, at acquaintances dismissed early because nothing concrete had tied them to the scene. One name resurfaced, then another, like ghosts refusing to stay buried. Meanwhile, the community had learned to live with the unanswered. New tenants came and went. The block hosted barbecues, arguments, laughter. Children grew up. Some moved away. Others stayed, carrying with them a vague sense that something bad had once happened here. Something that never found its ending. Every so often, a neighbor would bring it up, usually after dark, usually after a few drinks. Remember that girl. Remember how it just stopped. The case was officially labeled cold in 1998. The designation did not mean inactive. It meant waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for someone to slip. Waiting for a conscience to grow heavy enough to speak. The file was transferred to a unit with fewer resources and more patience, staffed by detectives who understood that progress in cases like this came in inches, not miles. They tried again with witnesses. Time had softened some edges, sharpened others. The woman on the 4th floor now insisted the footsteps she'd heard were running, not slow. The couple across the hall could no longer agree on whether the argument had been male and female or 2 men. Memory reshaped itself to fit the questions asked. The truth, whatever it was, sat somewhere in the middle, inaccessible. The ex-boyfriend was questioned again. His life had moved on. Marriage, children, a career that left little room for suspicion. His alibi still held. Phone records still placed him miles away. He answered politely, patiently, with the faint irritation of someone being pulled back into a nightmare he had not created. He was crossed off again. A breakthrough almost happened in 2001, when a similar murder in another borough raised alarms. Same age range, same lack of forced entry, same method. Detectives compared notes, hopeful, cautious. The similarities faded under scrutiny. Different circumstances, different timelines. A false echo, cruel in its promise. What the file did not have, what it had never had, was DNA. In 1995, collection standards were uneven. Preservation was inconsistent. The apartment had been cleaned before anyone imagined future testing might matter. What little biological material had been recovered was deemed insufficient, contaminated, useless, or so everyone believed. Years passed. The city changed again. Cameras appeared on corners. Phones grew smarter. Databases expanded. And quietly, without fanfare, old evidence was reevaluated under new protocols. A single item, logged as inconclusive, was pulled from storage. A fragment, a trace. Not enough to name someone, but enough to keep hope alive. The detective who signed out that evidence did so at the end of a long shift. He had seen dozens of cases die this way in small rooms under fluorescent lights. He did not expect a miracle. He expected confirmation of absence. Instead, the lab report came back with a possibility. Partial profile. Incomplete. Fragile. But real. It was entered into a system that did not exist when the murder happened, a digital net cast wide across decades. First, there was nothing. Then a near match. Not a suspect. A relative. Someone whose DNA sat in a database for an unrelated reason. A minor offense, a bureaucratic footnote. The connection was distant enough to be deniable, close enough to matter. The name that emerged was not familiar. It did not belong to anyone in the original file. That was both discouraging and exhilarating. It meant the killer had been outside the frame from the beginning, hiding in plain sight, untouched by the early investigation. Detectives began to build a new tree, branching outward, following bloodlines instead of alibis. The process was slow, painstaking, filled with dead ends. People moved. People died. Records were incomplete. But the direction was set. For the first time in years, the case was moving forward, not in leaps, but in deliberate, careful steps. Somewhere, a man was living his life, unaware or pretending to be, carrying a night from 1995 inside him like a sealed box. He went to work. He paid bills. He aged. He may have believed he had gotten away with it, that the city had forgotten his name before ever learning it. The truth was quieter, more patient. The truth was waiting. By the time the detectives realized how close they were, the snow had fallen and melted many times over, erasing footprints, laying new ones. The silence that had once felt permanent was thinning, stretched tight by science and persistence. The cold case was still cold, but it was no longer frozen solid. Somewhere within it, a crack had formed, and through that crack, the past was beginning to breathe again. The past does not announce its return. Creeps back in quietly, through spreadsheets and family trees, through names that mean nothing until suddenly they mean everything. The partial match sat on a screen for weeks before anyone dared to trust it. A cousin. Second degree. Close enough to suggest blood. Far enough to blur faces. Detectives stared at the data, knowing that this was the kind of lead that could resurrect a case or bury it deeper in disappointment. They had learned caution the hard way. Cold cases feed on hope and punish it without mercy. They began where the data pointed not to the suspect but to the family. Birth records, marriage licenses, addresses that shifted across boroughs and decades. The family tree grew dense, branches twisting back into neighborhoods that had changed names, changed faces, changed reputations. One name surfaced again and again in proximity to West 164th Street, to the hardware store, to the bodega. A man who lived close enough to walk, who worked jobs that kept him invisible, who left little behind except paperwork. In 1995, he would have been 32, old enough to plan, young enough to act without hesitation. He had no serious criminal record then, nothing that would have placed him in a database, nothing that would have drawn attention. He lived alone according to the census. No spouse, no children. The kind of life that leaves few witnesses. Detectives pulled his employment history, temporary work, construction, maintenance, jobs that gave him access to buildings, to locked doors, to the rhythms of apartment life. Jobs that taught him when people came and went, when hallways were empty, when no one asked questions. This was not proof. It was context. And context in a case like this was oxygen. They tracked down former coworkers. Most remembered nothing. A few remembered him as quiet, reliable, the kind of guy who showed up early and left late. One remembered a temper, quick and sharp, flaring over small slights. Another remembered him mentioning a woman who lived uptown, a woman he said didn't appreciate him enough. Names were not given. Dates were fuzzy. Still, the shape of a story began to form, incomplete but suggestive. The detectives debated their next move. Without a full DNA profile, without a direct link, approaching him risked tipping their hand. If he was the killer, he had lived undetected for decades. He would know how to disappear again. They needed more. Something tangible. Something that tied him not just to the family tree, but to the night. They went back to the evidence room. Back to the boxes that smelled of dust and resignation. Back to items catalogued and forgotten. Among them, a pair of gloves recovered from the apartment's trash chute, assumed to belong to the building staff, dismissed because they carried nothing obvious. At the time, testing had yielded no usable results. Now, with new methods, the gloves were examined again. Fibers, sweat, skin cells trapped in fabric that had never been meant to preserve them. The wait for the lab report was long enough to resurrect old anxieties. Detectives filled the time by walking the old routes. The 10-minute walk from the bodega to the apartment. The corner where the streetlight flickered. The doorway recessed just enough to hide someone waiting. They imagined the confrontation, brief and contained. No screams loud enough to wake the building. They imagined the moment when the door closed behind them, sealing fate inside four walls. When the call came, it was not dramatic. No celebration. Just numbers, percentages, probabilities. The gloves carried a partial profile consistent with the family line they were tracing. Not definitive. Not enough for an arrest. Enough to narrow the lens. Surveillance began quietly. The man was older now. Grayer. Slower. He lived in Queens, in a modest apartment with blinds always half-drawn. He worked a steady job, clocked in, clocked out. He bought groceries, watched television, nodded at neighbors without learning their names. There was nothing in his present that screamed violence. That was the most unsettling part. Monsters rarely look the part when they've had time to rehearse being human. Detectives watched him for weeks, learning his patterns, his habits. They noted the way he lingered in doorways, scanning before entering. The way he flinched at sudden noise. The way his posture changed when police cars passed, subtle but telling. These were impressions, not evidence, but impressions matter when you are building a case out of fragments. They needed a reason to talk to him, a pretext that wouldn't raise alarms. It came in the form of a cold case review, framed as routine, framed as closure for families. When they knocked on his door, he opened it without hesitation, a reflex learned over years of unremarkable interactions. He listened politely as they spoke. He nodded. He agreed to answer questions. At first, he denied knowing the victim. The denial was quick, automatic. Too quick. When shown her photograph, his eyes lingered a fraction of a second too long. He corrected himself, said maybe he'd seen her around. Hard not to in a city like New York. Everyone sees everyone. They asked about 1995, about where he lived then, about his work. His answers were smooth, rehearsed. He remembered dates with unnatural precision, as if he had practiced remembering them. When asked if he had ever been inside her building, he smiled, just briefly, and said no. The interview ended without confrontation, without accusation. Detectives left with more questions than answers, but also with something else. A sense of unease that settled heavy in the room after they were gone. He had not asked why they were asking. He had not expressed surprise. He had acted like someone who had always known this moment might come. The next step was riskier. They needed his DNA. Not through force. Not yet. Through what he left behind. A discarded cup. A cigarette butt. Something mundane. They followed him to a diner he frequented. Watched as he finished his coffee. Left the mug on the counter. Walked out without looking back. The mug was collected discreetly, sent to the lab like a message in a bottle. Waiting became a familiar enemy again. Days stretched. The detectives prepared themselves for disappointment. Partial matches fall apart all the time. Contamination. Coincidence. The city is full of people who share fragments of code. The results came back late on a Friday. The kind of timing that guarantees no sleep. The DNA from the mug was a match to the partial profile from the gloves. Stronger now. Clearer. The probability narrowed until coincidence became absurd. It was still not enough. A defense attorney would tear it apart. They needed context. Motive. Opportunity. They dug deeper into his past, into relationships that had left no official record. They found a restraining order filed by a woman in the early 90s, a woman whose name was different but whose description matched a pattern. Stalking, obsession, anger when attention was withdrawn. The order had expired. The file had been closed. The behavior had not. They found a connection to the hardware store. He had worked there briefly in 1994, just long enough to learn the layout, the inventory, the habits of the customers. Just long enough to know when she shopped, what she bought, how she paid. The receipt was no longer just a receipt. It was a meeting point. The picture that emerged was still incomplete, but it was coherent. A man who noticed a woman. A man who mistook routine kindness for invitation. A man who believed access was owed. The night of the murder was no longer a blank. It was a culmination. As the pieces aligned, the weight of 30 years pressed down. The detectives understood what they were holding. Not just a case, but a reckoning. For the victim, frozen at 27. For the community that had learned to live with unanswered questions. For a city that had moved on without knowing it was leaving someone behind. The decision to arrest would come later. Warrants would be drafted. Supervisors consulted. But in that moment, staring at lab results and faded photographs, the silence that had wrapped this case for decades finally broke. It did not shatter. It cracked, slow and deliberate, releasing a truth that had been waiting, patient and unforgiving, for the right moment to be heard. The city did not feel the shift when the decision was made, but inside the precinct the air changed. Conversations lowered. Doors stayed closed a little longer. The name that had once been just another entry on a family tree now carried weight, enough to bend procedure around it. 30 years of waiting had condensed into a few pages of paperwork, and every word on those pages mattered. An arrest made too early would collapse under its own ambition. An arrest made too late might never happen at all. Detectives moved carefully, aware that the man they were circling had survived on instinct and restraint. They rebuilt the timeline with a new lens, threading his movements through the night in question, aligning bus routes, pay stubs, weather reports. Snowfall records placed him outdoors during the window of the estimated time of death. A time card from a temporary job showed he had left early that evening, citing illness. No one had questioned it. No one had needed to. They returned to the building on West 164th Street, this time not as investigators chasing shadows, but as archivists of truth. The locks had been replaced twice since 1995, but the frame was the same. Measurements were taken, angles calculated. A reconstruction expert demonstrated how the door could be opened with minimal force, how a familiar knock could lower defenses just long enough. The phrase, "no sign of forced entry," lost its innocence. It had never meant safety. It had meant trust. The gloves became central now, elevated from overlooked debris to silent witnesses. Fiber analysis linked them to a brand sold at the hardware store where he had worked, a model common enough to avoid attention, rare enough to narrow distribution. Under magnification, the wear patterns told a story of repeated use, of hands that gripped and released again. They were not disposable. They were kept. The detectives needed him to talk again. This time, they would not come with open-ended questions and polite nods. This time, they would bring weight. When they knocked on his door for the second interview, he hesitated before opening, just a beat longer than necessary. Inside, the apartment was neat, almost sparse. No photographs. No personal touches. A life designed to leave little behind. They sat across from him at a small table. The questions began the same way, casual, familiar. He answered, confident, rehearsed. Then the shift came. A photograph of the gloves, laid flat between them. A pause. His eyes flicked down, then away. Microseconds, but enough. The detectives leaned in, voices steady, explaining the advances in forensic science, the way time no longer protected secrets. They spoke of family trees and partial matches, of cups left on diner counters. He laughed, softly, shaking his head. Coincidence, he said. Bad luck. People share DNA. New York is full of people. The laugh did not reach his eyes. His hands, which had been still, now fidgeted, fingers rubbing together as if remembering a texture. They asked him about the victim using her name. The sound of it landed heavy in the room. He corrected them on the pronunciation. He said it automatically without thinking, and then froze. The detectives exchanged a glance. He had never been told how to say it. The interview ended abruptly. He asked for a lawyer. The room exhaled after he left, tension draining into the walls. They had not gotten a confession. They had gotten something better, a crack in the armor. Outside, the city continued its indifference. Traffic honked. Vendors shouted. Somewhere, a radio played a song from the 90s, nostalgia stripped of context. Inside the precinct, the case accelerated. Warrants were drafted for a search of his apartment, his storage unit, his vehicle. Judges were cautious, but the accumulation of evidence pushed the scale. The search yielded fragments. A newspaper clipping, yellowed, folded small enough to hide in a drawer. The headline was familiar. A young woman, an apartment, an ongoing investigation. The clipping was not marked. It did not need to be. It had been kept for a reason. There was also a roll of duct tape, old, the cardboard core softened with age. Forensic testing could not place it at the scene. It did not have to. Its presence spoke to continuity, to habits that do not break easily. They found a notebook, mostly blank, except for a few pages near the back. Dates, addresses, short phrases that meant nothing on their own. When cross-referenced, some aligned with places the victim had been seen. Others did not. A pattern emerged, unsettling in its implication. She may not have been the first fixation. She may have been the one who resisted just enough to be remembered. The defense moved quickly, as expected. Motions were filed to suppress evidence, to challenge the DNA collection, to question the reliability of memory after 3 decades. The courtroom became a battlefield of words, each side aware that the jury would not just be weighing facts, but time itself. How much doubt does time create? How much truth does it preserve? As the pretrial hearings unfolded, the victim's family returned to the city. They had aged in different directions, grief carving its own lines. They sat together, quiet, listening to arguments about probabilities and procedures, about what could and could not be known. For them, the night had never ended. It had simply stretched. The man at the center of it all sat impassive, eyes forward, expression controlled. He had practiced this too. The stillness, the neutrality. Only once did his composure slip, when a photograph of the apartment interior was displayed, the bedroom doorway frozen in time. His jaw tightened. His gaze dropped. The moment passed, but it was recorded. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Reporters rehearsed their lines, ready to resurrect words that had been dormant for decades. Cold case. Breakthrough. Suspect identified. The community listened, cautious, unwilling to celebrate before the final word was spoken. They had learned what hope could do. Inside, the prosecution built its narrative carefully. Not a monster. A man. A man who believed access was permission. A man who prepared, who waited, who chose a moment when the city would not look too closely. They spoke of opportunity shaped by proximity, of motive shaped by obsession, of evidence shaped by time and science. They acknowledged the gaps. They argued that gaps did not equal innocence. The defense countered with doubt, with the fragility of memory, with the danger of retrofitting stories to data. They painted a picture of a life lived quietly, unremarkably, of a man being pulled into a past he did not own. They questioned why, if he was capable of this once, he had not done it again. The answer hovered unspoken, heavy. Some crimes do not need repetition. Some crimes consume the people who commit them. As the hearings drew to a close, the judge ruled that the DNA evidence would be admissible. The ruling did not decide guilt. It decided that the story would be told in full. The sound of the gavel echoed, sharp and final, and in that sound, the case crossed a threshold. There was no going back to silence now. The city still did not pause. It never does. But somewhere between the courthouse steps and a third-floor apartment long since repainted, the past pressed closer to the present. 30 years of quiet were giving way to something louder, more dangerous. The truth was stepping into the light, and it was no longer content to wait. Trial days do not feel dramatic from the inside. They feel procedural, compressed, heavy with rules that grind emotion into something admissible. Yet beneath the formal language and measured pace, the past thrashed like a live wire. Each morning, the courtroom filled with a low murmur that sounded almost respectful, as if everyone present understood they were standing at the edge of something long delayed. 30 years had sharpened the appetite for answers and dulled the patience for excuses. The prosecution began not with the night of the murder, but with the city itself. They spoke of 1995 as a place and a pressure, a New York still learning how to trust daylight, still negotiating with fear after sunset. They placed the jury on West 164th Street, described the way snow absorbs sound, how footsteps vanish into white. They did not rush. They understood that to prove intent, you first had to establish opportunity, and opportunity, in this case, lived in familiarity. Witnesses took the stand one by one, their voices carrying the weight of years. The bodega clerk, older now, pointed to the photograph and nodded slowly. Yes, that was her. Yes, that was the night. He remembered because she was kind. He remembered because kindness lingers. When asked if he recognized the defendant, he hesitated, then shook his head. Faces blur. Time erases. The defense smiled. Doubt was their currency. The hardware store owner followed. He spoke of tape and light bulbs, of a man who asked too many questions about strength and hold. He could not swear it was the defendant. He could only say it fit. Fit was not certainty. Fit was suggestion. The jury listened, pens hovering. Then came the gloves. An expert in forensic textiles explained fibers and wear, how patterns form over repeated use, how hands leave stories even when faces do not. She spoke of the DNA recovered, partial but consistent, strengthened by comparison. She used words like probability and exclusion, careful words designed to survive cross-examination. The defense attacked the timeline, the storage conditions, the possibility of contamination. The expert stood firm. Science had advanced. Truth had caught up. The defense's strategy was clear. If they could fracture the story into isolated facts, each insufficient alone, the whole would collapse. They emphasized the lack of eyewitnesses, the absence of a confession, the years of silence. They asked the jury to imagine how easy it would be to mistake coincidence for connection when desperation sets in. They reminded them that the burden of proof had not aged. It was still beyond a reasonable doubt. When the victim's friends testified, the courtroom shifted. These were not experts. They were memory keepers. They spoke of routines, of caution, of a woman who did not open doors for strangers. They spoke of a name she mentioned once, in passing, attached to discomfort. A man who watched too closely. A man who did not take hints. The defense objected. Hearsay. The judge sustained some, allowed others. Fragments remained, enough to sketch an outline of unease. The defendant sat still throughout, eyes forward, jaw set. He did not react when the victim's photograph appeared on the screen. Younger than everyone in the room, frozen at 27. He did not react when her voice, captured on an old answering machine tape, played briefly, a message about rescheduling dinner. He had practiced this neutrality, built it like a wall. The prosecution saved their most delicate move for the end of the week. They called a behavioral analyst not to diagnose, not to label, but to explain patterns. Obsession without escalation. Fixation that burns hot and then collapses inward. Crimes of proximity, where access is mistaken for permission. The analyst spoke carefully, aware of the line between education and persuasion. The defense objected. The judge allowed it limited, precise. As the days passed, the jury absorbed not just facts, but atmosphere. They felt the weight of delay, the frustration of missed chances, the quiet horror of a life interrupted and then forgotten by necessity. They heard about the notebook, the addresses, the clipped articles. They saw the newspaper clipping, folded small, kept long. Possession is not guilt, the defense argued. Memory is not crime. But why keep this one? Cross-examination of the defendant was the moment everyone anticipated, and the moment that delivered the least. He spoke calmly, evenly. He denied knowing her beyond passing sight. He denied being in the building. He denied everything without anger, without fear. When asked about the pronunciation of her name, he paused, then said he must have heard it in the media. The prosecution let the answer sit. They did not push. They let the jury feel the strain. Outside the courtroom, the story reignited. Headlines returned with sharper edges. Cold case. Decades later. Killer identified. The community read and reread. Cautious. Some remembered the candles. Some remembered nothing at all. Younger residents learned the story for the first time, shocked that such quiet violence could live under their feet. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution tightened their focus. They did not claim perfection. They claimed coherence. They argued that the evidence, taken together, told a single story that did not bend under scrutiny. A man noticed. A man prepared. A man entered without force because force was not necessary. A man left believing time would protect him. The defense countered with restraint. They spoke of the danger of narrative, of the human need to fill gaps. They warned the jury against letting sympathy for the victim harden into certainty about the defendant. They reminded them that the city is full of men who look alike, who share fragments of DNA, who live unremarkable lives. They asked a simple question again and again. Is this enough? Deliberation began on a gray afternoon. The jury filed out carrying binders and doubt. Hours passed, then a night, then another morning. The courtroom waited, suspended. The defendant waited, eyes closed now, as if resting. The family waited, hands clasped, breath shallow. When the jury returned, the room stood. The foreperson's voice trembled slightly as she read. Guilty. The word landed without drama, heavy and irrevocable. The victim's family exhaled, some for the first time in years. The defendant did not move. His face remained composed, but something shifted behind his eyes. A tightening, a retreat. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. The legal process would continue, grinding forward as it always does. But the verdict did something the law rarely acknowledges. It ended a waiting. It closed a door that had been left ajar for 3 decades. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters spoke of closure, of justice delayed but delivered. Inside, the courtroom emptied slowly, people reluctant to break the spell. The city resumed its rhythm, indifferent as ever. But for one block, for one family, for one name that had refused to fade, the silence finally gave way to sound. And still, beneath the verdict and the headlines, the truth lingered, complex and unfinished. A life was not restored. Time was not reversed. What had been taken remained taken. Justice had arrived late, limping, imperfect, but it had arrived. And in its wake, the cold case that had haunted New York for 30 years finally released its grip, leaving behind not peace, but something closer to it than silence had ever allowed. The verdict did not end the story, cracked it open. Justice, once delivered, has a way of exposing everything it did not fix. In the days after the courtroom emptied, New York absorbed the news with a familiar shrug. Headlines folded into the endless stack of solved horrors. But beneath that surface, questions stirred, quieter and more dangerous than before. The man had been found guilty. The cold case had a name attached to it now. And yet the past did not feel settled, felt disturbed. The victim's family returned home carrying something heavier than relief. Closure is a word used by people who have never waited 30 years for a knock that might never come. What they felt was gravity easing slightly, the constant pull loosening just enough to breathe. They sorted through boxes they had avoided for decades. Letters, photographs, old answering machine tapes. In one envelope, tucked behind a birthday card, they found a note she had written but never sent. It mentioned a man who made her uncomfortable, a man who showed up where he shouldn't. She had downplayed it, brushed it off. promising herself she was overreacting. Reading it now felt like listening to a warning that had traveled too slowly through time. The prosecution reviewed the case internally, preparing for the inevitable appeal. Defense attorneys do not accept verdicts like this quietly. They sharpen their arguments, looking for cracks in procedure, for moments where certainty leaned too heavily on inference. They questioned the DNA again, its partial nature, its journey through decades of storage. They questioned the notebook, the interpretation of dates and addresses. They questioned the behavioral testimony, the danger of painting motive with broad strokes. The appeal papers grew thick, heavy with language designed to slow the machinery of consequence. Meanwhile, journalists dug deeper. The solved cold case had legs. It always does. They traced the defendant's life backward, interviewing former neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances who had never imagined themselves adjacent to murder. Some were shocked. Some were not. One woman, who asked not to be named, recalled how he used to wait outside her building, offering help she had not requested, watching too closely when she declined. She had moved shortly after. She had never reported it. She had assumed it was nothing. Other stories surfaced, less clear, less provable. A woman who remembered a knock late at night in the mid-90s. A man asking for someone who did not live there. Another who remembered a presence in the laundry room, silent and lingering. None of these incidents had names attached. None had dates precise enough to matter legally. But together, they formed a shadow, stretching longer than the crime itself. Inside the precinct, detectives revisited the notebook. With the verdict secured, they could afford to ask a question they had avoided. Was she the only one? The addresses were cross-referenced again, this time without the urgency of trial, with the patience of pattern recognition. Some led nowhere. Others aligned with women who had moved abruptly, changed numbers, altered routines without ever explaining why. Fear leaves little paper trail. They contacted a few cautiously, respectfully. Some declined to speak. Some spoke off the record, voices shaking, recounting moments they had buried, being followed, being watched, being touched without permission in hallways where sound did not travel. None could place him definitively at their door. None needed to. They had learned, as she had learned too late, that certainty is not required for danger to be real. The defense seized on this wave of implication, arguing in the court of public opinion that rumor was replacing fact, that a guilty verdict was encouraging revisionism. They warned against turning a man into a symbol, against letting one crime retroactively stain an entire life. The argument landed with some. It always does. Doubt is comfortable. Doubt absolves. Sentencing day arrived without ceremony. The courtroom was quieter this time, attendance thinner. The judge spoke of the seriousness of the crime, of the years lost, of the extraordinary delay. He acknowledged the role of science, of persistence, of luck. He sentenced the defendant to decades in prison, a number that sounded abstract when measured against a life already half-lived. The man listened, expressionless, as if the words were being spoken to someone else. He did not speak during allocution. He did not apologize. He did not deny. Silence can be many things: defiance, acceptance, calculation. The family searched his face for something, anything, that resembled recognition of what he had taken. They found none. The absence hurt more than anger would have. Afterward, outside the courthouse, microphones crowded close. Questions were asked about closure, about lessons learned, about the promise of cold case technology. Officials spoke carefully, emphasizing commitment, emphasizing hope. The city likes narratives of progress. It likes believing the past can be corrected with enough patience and data. But inside the evidence room, among the boxes and shelves, the case took on a different shape. It became a reminder of what had been missed. The early assumptions, the overlooked receipt, the gloves dismissed too quickly. Detectives who had worked the case in the 90s, now retired, watched the coverage with mixed emotions. Pride in the resolution, guilt over the delay. They knew better than anyone how thin the line is between solved and forgotten. The apartment on West 164th Street had long since changed hands again. The current tenant learned the story from a neighbor, late one night, the way these stories always surface. She stood in the doorway afterward, listening to the building breathe, wondering how much of the past still clung to the walls. She slept with the lights on for a week. Then she adapted. People always do. The cold case unit moved on, as units must. New files, new names, new silences waiting to be broken. But this case lingered not as a triumph, but as a caution. Proved that time does not erase guilt. It also proved that time does not heal wounds on its own. It simply covers them, layer by layer, until something sharp cuts through again. Months later, a letter arrived at the precinct, handwritten, careful. It was from the defendant. He did not confess. He did not explain. He asked about the evidence, about the DNA, about how they had found him after so long. The letter was read, logged, filed. Curiosity is not remorse. Understanding is not accountability. The victim's family declined to read it. They had spent enough years waiting for words that would never come. As winter returned to the city, snow fell again on Upper Manhattan, thin and quiet, turning sidewalks into blank pages. People walked over them without looking down. Somewhere, in a cell far from the street where it had all begun, a man lay awake, counting time in a new way, measuring silence not as protection, but as consequence. And somewhere else, in a box of memories finally opened, a woman's handwriting breathed again, her cautionary note no longer ignored. The case had been solved, the law had spoken, but the true weight of what happened in 1995 could not be contained by a verdict. It lived on in habits changed, in doors locked twice, in glances over shoulders that never quite went away. The cold case was closed on paper. In the city, it remained what it had always been. A reminder that danger does not announce itself, that trust can be exploited, that the past waits patiently for the future to catch up. Time inside a prison moves differently. It stretches and compresses, folding days into routines that dull the edges of memory. For the man convicted of the 1995 murder, life became a sequence of counts and lights, meals served without choice, conversations overheard but rarely joined. He learned quickly that notoriety fades even behind bars. New arrivals brought newer crimes, fresher rumors. His name carried weight for a while, then settled into obscurity, just another file in a system built on repetition. Outside, the appeal advanced slowly, deliberately, like everything else tied to this case. Legal briefs stacked up, thick with citations and counterarguments. The defense focused on procedure, on the DNA collection from the diner mug, on whether consent could truly be implied in a public place. They argued that science had been allowed to substitute for certainty, that the story told at trial was persuasive rather than provable. The prosecution responded with methodical precision, line by line, reminding the court that justice is not fragile, that it can withstand scrutiny. For the victim's family, the appeal reopened wounds they had barely begun to cover. Every filing felt like a hand reaching backward, threatening to pull them back into the waiting. They attended fewer hearings now, choosing distance over endurance. They trusted the process because they had no other option. Trust, once broken, is rarely restored fully. In the community, the story shifted again. Without the daily drumbeat of trial coverage, the case became something people referenced rather than followed. It entered conversations as an example, a cautionary tale. Parents told daughters to be careful without explaining why. Landlords installed new locks, new cameras, as if hardware could rewrite history. The building on West 164th Street became anonymous again, its past tucked beneath layers of fresh paint and new tenants. Detectives who had shepherded the case through its final years found themselves changed by it. Cold case work leaves a residue. Teaches patience, but it also teaches regret. They reviewed other files with sharper eyes now, more willing to challenge early assumptions, more sensitive to details that once seemed too small to matter. A receipt, a glove, a pause before answering a question. The solved case did not make them optimistic. It made them vigilant. One detective, nearing retirement, began giving informal talks to younger officers. He did not frame the story as a victory. He framed it as a warning. He spoke about how quickly momentum can die, how easily a case can slip from urgent to dormant. He spoke about humility, about the danger of certainty in the absence of proof. He never mentioned the victim's name. He did not need to. The lesson carried its own weight. The appeal hearing came and went with little fanfare. Judges listened, asked questions, reserved decision. Months passed. When the ruling arrived, it was concise, unsentimental. Conviction upheld. The evidence had been lawfully obtained. The jury had been properly instructed. The verdict stood. There was no celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement that the legal chapter had narrowed, if not closed entirely. In prison, the man received the news with a nod. Those who observed him later would say he seemed unsurprised. Perhaps he had always known that time could reveal as much as it hides. Perhaps he simply adjusted, as he always had, to the shape of the moment. He filed fewer motions after that. His letters stopped. Journalists moved on, chasing new scandals, new horrors. The case resurfaced occasionally in long-form pieces, anniversary retrospectives, discussions about forensic genealogy and its power. Each retelling simplified something, smoothed an edge, made the story more digestible. The reality resisted that treatment. It was messier, heavier, unwilling to be reduced to a moral. For the women who had come forward quietly after the verdict, life resumed its careful rhythm. Speaking had not brought closure. It had brought recognition, and that mattered more. They compared notes, cautiously, discovering overlaps in experience that had once felt isolated. None pursued charges. They knew better than most how the system measures time, how it weighs memory. They had already won something less visible. Validation. The city, as ever, adapted. It always does. New buildings rose. Old ones fell. Neighborhoods renamed themselves. The generation that had lived through 1995 aged into nostalgia, telling stories of a harsher New York with a strange fondness. Younger residents listened without context, unable to imagine a city without phones in every pocket, cameras on every corner. Technology continued its quiet march. DNA databases expanded. Algorithms grew sharper. Cold case units received new funding, new mandates. Solved cases were touted as proof of progress. Unsolved ones waited, patient and unmoved by press releases. The lesson of this case lingered in policy discussions, in training manuals, in the unspoken understanding that delay is not neutrality. Delay is a choice with consequences. On certain nights, when the city slowed just enough to hear itself breathe, the story returned in fragments. A neighbor recalling candles on a stoop. A clerk remembering exact change. A detective remembering a door that had not been forced because it did not need to be. These memories did not align neatly. They did not need to. They formed a mosaic, incomplete but honest. The victim's name appeared on a small plaque at a community center years later, part of a memorial for lives lost to violence in the 90s. It was not a grand gesture. It was quiet, almost hidden. Her family attended the unveiling, standing among strangers who did not know her but felt connected by something unspoken. They touched the plaque briefly, then stepped back. Memory does not require ceremony. It requires maintenance. As the seasons turned, the case receded further into the archive of solved crimes, its edges blunted by familiarity. Yet its impact persisted in subtle ways. In how investigators approached locked doors. In how women trusted their instincts. In how the city understood that danger does not always announce itself with noise. The cold case had begun with silence and ended with a verdict, but its true arc stretched beyond both. It lived in the spaces between attention and neglect, between certainty and doubt. It reminded those who paid attention that justice is not a moment. It is a process that unfolds unevenly, shaped by human error and human persistence. And somewhere, beneath the constant motion of New York, the night of 1995 remained what it had always been. A fixed point, a scream swallowed by walls, a door that opened, a life interrupted. The city moved on, but the echo never fully faded. Years passed, and with distance came reinterpretation. What had once been a breaking news banner settled into something more ambiguous, a case study cited in conferences, a paragraph in criminal justice textbooks, a reference point for what persistence and technology could accomplish together. But abstraction has a cost. It smooths over the jagged edges, the nights without sleep, the lives that bent permanently around a single moment of violence. Those edges remained sharp for the people who carried them. In the cold case unit, the file was officially archived, stamped, and shelved, its journey complete in the eyes of the system. Yet the detectives who had lived with it knew that completion is a legal fiction. They returned to the notes sometimes, not because they expected revelation, but because the case had taught them how to read silence. They had learned to listen to what was not said, to question what was assumed, to respect the way fear rearranges memory. Those lessons followed them into other investigations, quietly shaping outcomes that would never be linked back to 1995. One detective, now supervising a new generation, noticed how often young officers reached for certainty. He interrupted them gently, asking how they knew what they claimed to know, asking what they might be missing. He spoke of doors without damage, of trust mistaken for safety. He never dramatized it. He did not have to. The weight of experience did the work for him. For the victim's family, life became an exercise in selective remembering. They chose what to hold close and what to let blur. Birthdays were still hard. Anniversaries came and went with less sting but more reflection. They spoke of her more often now, not as a tragedy, but as a person who had lived a full, if brief, life. They told stories that had nothing to do with the night that ended it. Laughter returned, cautiously, like a guest who wasn't sure they were welcome. The man in prison aged quietly. His hair thinned, his movements slowed. He avoided attention, declined interviews, refused participation in documentaries that promised notoriety in exchange for words. Some interpreted this as shame, others as strategy. The truth, as always, resisted simple labels. He lived within the constraints of his sentence, counting time by institutional markers rather than seasons. The outside world became an abstraction, a rumor carried in by guards and newspapers. Occasionally, his name surfaced in letters sent to advocacy groups, from people questioning the verdict, questioning the science, questioning the ethics of forensic genealogy. The debate grew louder as the technique solved more cases. Privacy versus justice. Consent versus public safety. The case from 1995 became a touchstone, cited by both sides, pulled in opposite directions. Few mentioned the woman at the center of it. Fewer still remembered her face without a photograph. The city itself continued to evolve. Upper Manhattan changed again, as cities do, absorbing waves of new residents who knew nothing of the past beyond what was convenient. Cafes replaced bodegas. Rents climbed. Old routines vanished. The block on West 164th Street looked cleaner, brighter, less burdened. And yet, for those who had lived there then, something remained. A sense that the street had learned a lesson the hard way. A documentary crew arrived one summer, cameras small and efficient, questions rehearsed. They interviewed detectives, lawyers, journalists. They stood outside the building, capturing footage of fire escapes and stoops, searching for atmosphere. The family declined to participate. They had learned that retelling does not always heal. Sometimes it only rearranges pain for public consumption. The documentary aired anyway. It was polished, compelling, structured for maximum engagement. Viewers binge-watched, speculated, debated online. Some declared the verdict inevitable. Others questioned it loudly, confidently, armed with half-understood science and full conviction. The comment sections filled with certainty, as they always do. The truth sat quietly beneath the noise, unchanged. In the precinct, an envelope arrived one morning, unmarked, addressed simply. Inside was a photocopy of a photograph from the mid-90s. The victim stood at a gathering, smiling, unaware. In the background, partially obscured, stood a man whose face was not quite visible, turned away at the wrong moment. The sender included no explanation, no note. Detectives examined it carefully, comparing angles, proportions, shadows. It was inconclusive. It always is. They logged it, filed it, and felt the familiar mix of frustration and resolve. Even after resolution, the past continued to knock. The women who had spoken quietly after the trial began meeting informally, a small circle bound by shared unease rather than shared harm. They talked about vigilance, about how they navigated public spaces, about the exhaustion of always calculating risk. They did not center the man. They centered themselves. That, in the end, felt like a reclamation. Cold case units across the country cited the investigation as a model, not because it was perfect, but because it demonstrated endurance. Grants were written. Task forces expanded. Old evidence rooms were reorganized. Cases that had been considered dead stirred briefly, as if testing the air. Some would yield answers. Many would not. Hope, like evidence, must be handled carefully. The family visited the city less often now. When they did, they walked past the building without stopping, without looking up. They had learned that place holds power only if you give it permission. They preferred to remember her elsewhere, in kitchens and parks and laughter that had nothing to do with death. As the 30th anniversary of the crime approached, journalists reached out again, sensing a narrative milestone. Cold case solved after decades. Silence broken. Justice served. The phrases wrote themselves. Officials prepared statements. Detectives declined interviews. The family remained silent. They had said what they needed to say long ago. On the anniversary night, snow fell again, thin and quiet, an echo without intention. The city did not mark it. No candles. No tape. Just the ordinary movement of people going where they were going, unaware of the significance beneath their feet. That was how it should be, perhaps. Memory does not require spectacle to persist. Inside a prison cell, a man lay awake, staring at a ceiling he had memorized. He thought, perhaps, of doors and hallways, of moments when choices are made without witnesses. Or perhaps he thought of nothing at all. The mind protects itself in ways no court can measure. In an apartment far away, a woman locked her door and double-checked the chain, a habit passed down like an heirloom of caution. She did not know the name associated with the habit. She did not need to. The lesson had traveled without it. The cold case had been solved, yes, in the language of law and databases, but its true resolution lived elsewhere, dispersed through a city that learned, slowly, to listen more carefully to the quiet. It lived in changed procedures, in raised eyebrows at assumptions, in the understanding that patience is not passive. It is active, demanding, relentless. And somewhere, beyond headlines and verdicts, a life once interrupted continued to ripple outward, shaping choices, sharpening instincts, reminding those who paid attention that the past is never truly past. It waits. Time has a way of reordering importance. What once felt urgent becomes archival. What once seemed peripheral grows heavy with meaning. In the years following the resolution of the case, this reordering played out quietly, almost invisibly, across institutions and individual lives alike. The case no longer demanded attention, but it continued to instruct, like a scar that teaches the body where it is vulnerable. Within the justice system, policy memos circulated, cautious in tone, deliberate in phrasing. Forensic genealogy was no longer new, no longer miraculous. It was now subject to guidelines, oversight committees, internal review boards. Consent frameworks were revised. Databases refined their terms. Each change referenced unnamed cases, anonymized precedents. But everyone knew which investigation had accelerated the conversation. Progress rarely acknowledges its catalysts directly. It prefers footnotes to monuments. A law professor assigned the case to her seminar, not as a triumph, but as a dilemma. She asked students to trace the arc from crime scene to conviction and then to step outside it. Who benefits from certainty, she asked, and who pays its cost? The discussion was uneven, heated, thoughtful. Some students spoke of victims' rights with reverence. Others questioned the reach of the state into private genetic data. The professor listened, then reminded them that the woman at the center had no say in any of it. Silence followed. Education, she knew, was not about answers but about discomfort that sharpens thinking. In the city archives, A junior librarian digitized old newspaper clippings, scanning headlines into searchable databases. She paused at the familiar phrase, "cold case solved," and wondered how many times it had been used, how often it flattened complexity into closure. She tagged the article carefully, adding metadata that would outlive her tenure. Future researchers would find it easily, stripped of the emotional context that once made it feel urgent. The detectives retired one by one. Their farewells were understated. A plaque, a handshake, a cake in the break room. They carried the case with them not as a trophy but as a reference point. At reunions, it surfaced briefly, then receded. They spoke more about families, about health, about the strange relief of sleeping through the night. Yet when pressed, they admitted that certain details still surfaced uninvited. The smell of stairwells, the echo of unanswered phones, the precise way a hallway light flickered in winter. For the family, grief evolved into something quieter, less jagged but no less present. They moved houses, changed routines, built lives that did not orbit loss. And still there were moments, a voice in a crowd, a laugh overheard, that pulled them backward without warning. They learned not to fight it. Grief, like memory, resists discipline. It arrives on its own schedule. One family member began volunteering with a victims' advocacy group, offering support that was practical rather than sentimental. She helped people fill out forms, explained court procedures, sat with them during long waits. She rarely spoke of her own history. When asked why she volunteered, she said simply that confusion was easier to bear with company. It was the truest explanation she could give. The man in prison developed a routine so precise it bordered on ritual. Wake, count, work, eat, read, sleep. He avoided introspection by design. Reflection, he had learned, could be dangerous. It opened doors that could not be closed. He wrote letters he never sent, tore them up, rewrote them, discarded them again. Some were addressed to no one in particular. Others bore names he could not bring himself to complete. The prison library became his refuge. Books asked nothing of him except attention. Outside, advocacy groups continued to debate his guilt in abstract terms. Some raised funds. Others organized panels. The case became symbolic, a stand-in for broader arguments about technology and justice. Symbolism, however, has a way of erasing specificity. In the arguments, the victim became a placeholder, her individuality sacrificed for rhetorical efficiency. A journalist who had covered the case from the beginning wrote a reflective piece years later, less concerned with revelation than with reckoning. He described the early days, the urgency, the speculation, the pressure to produce narratives before facts had settled. He acknowledged mistakes, assumptions that had hardened too quickly. The piece did not go viral. It was too measured, too late, too unwilling to inflame. Still, it mattered to those who read it carefully. Accountability rarely trends. In the neighborhood, memory persisted in subtle ways. Longtime residents referenced the building indirectly, with a tilt of the head, a pause mid-sentence. Newcomers remained unaware. Children played on sidewalks that once felt dangerous, their laughter unburdened by history. This was not erasure but layering. The city adding life atop life, refusing to freeze in deference to tragedy. A community meeting addressed public safety, prompted by an unrelated incident. Speakers discussed lighting, patrols, communication. An older woman stood and spoke about vigilance without fear, about watching out for one another without suspicion. She did not mention the case. She did not need to. Her words carried the residue of lived experience, resonating with those who understood. The technology that had cracked the case advanced rapidly. Algorithms grew more precise. Databases expanded globally. Ethical frameworks struggled to keep pace. What had once seemed extraordinary became routine, then expected. This normalization unsettled some investigators. They worried about complacency, about the temptation to trust outputs without interrogating inputs. The case from 1995 was cited in internal trainings as a reminder that tools do not replace judgment. They amplify it for better or worse. In a quiet moment, One detective revisited the original crime scene alone, standing across the street with no badge, no authority, no agenda. The building looked smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he had grown larger around the memory. He stayed only a moment, then walked away, satisfied not by closure but by continuity. The case had ended. The lesson had not. The family marked the anniversary privately, lighting a candle at home, sharing stories that had nothing to do with courts or evidence. They spoke of her stubbornness, her humor, her tendency to leave books half-read. These details mattered more than any verdict. They reclaimed her from the narrative that had consumed her. Meanwhile, the phrase cold case continued to circulate, a journalistic shorthand that promised drama and resolution. It sold stories. It attracted clicks. It suggested that time itself was an adversary, something to be defeated. But time, the case had shown, is neither enemy nor ally. It is a condition, one that changes what can be seen and how. As debates persisted, as policies evolved, as memories softened and sharpened in turns, the case settled into its true form. Not an ending, but a junction. Paths diverged from it, professional, ethical, personal, each shaped by the same origin but leading elsewhere. The violence that began it could not be undone. What followed it, however, remained subject to choice. And so the story continued, not in headlines, but in habits and hesitations, in procedures revised and instincts honed, in the quiet resolve to look again at what had been overlooked. The cold case had been solved, yes, but its meaning was still being written, line by line, in lives that would never appear in any file. The city moved on because cities always do, propelled by schedules and construction permits and the low, constant hum of survival. But beneath that motion, the case lingered like a frequency only some could hear. It surfaced in moments that felt unrelated. A delayed train, a late-night news alert, a chance remark about DNA or privacy. And suddenly the past pressed itself into the present with unsettling clarity. Years after the conviction, an internal audit quietly revisited the investigation, not to challenge its outcome but to understand its mechanics. The report was clinical, stripped of drama, dense with procedural language. It traced decision trees, logged timestamps, compared alternatives that had never been pursued. In one section, a reviewer noted how easily the case could have remained dormant had one database search been delayed by a single budget cycle. Justice, the report implied without saying so, had hinged on timing as much as truth. That idea unsettled younger investigators who read it. They had grown up believing in inevitability, that data, properly applied, would always converge on answers. The audit suggested otherwise. It showed fragility. It showed how close the system came to silence, how many other files sat in storage waiting for a similar alignment of chance and persistence. The case became a cautionary tale not about failure, but about contingency. At a conference on criminal justice reform, a panel referenced the investigation obliquely. Speakers discussed transparency, consent, oversight. One audience member asked whether the ends could ever justify invasive means. The room grew tense. A former prosecutor answered carefully, acknowledging both the relief of resolution and the discomfort of the method. He said justice was not a destination but a negotiation. Some nodded. Others bristled. The question lingered long after the session ended. For the family, anniversaries lost their sharpness but gained weight. Each year marked another layer of distance from the moment that had defined them. They learned that time does not heal so much as it rearranges. Pain becomes less acute, more architectural, a structure around which life is built. They did not dismantle it. They learned to live within it. One relative kept a box of letters received after the case was declared solved. Some were sympathetic. Others were invasive, demanding, even accusatory. She read them once, then sealed the box. Public interest, she understood, was not the same as care. The world wanted stories, not people. She refused to let her loss become a consumable. The man in prison aged visibly. His hair thinned, his posture softened, his movements slowed. He attended therapy sessions sporadically, never fully committing, never fully withdrawing. When asked about the past, he spoke in abstractions, avoiding detail as if precision might trap him. Guards noticed he flinched at certain phrases: closure, finality, truth. Words, it seemed, could wound as sharply as facts. Outside, legal scholars dissected the trial transcripts, parsing language for bias, for presumption, for narrative framing. They noted how certainty had been constructed incrementally, how doubt had been managed rather than eliminated. In law reviews, the case became a lens through which broader systemic issues were examined. The victim's name appeared less frequently than citations. Scholarship, like journalism, had its own economy. A filmmaker optioned the rights to a dramatization, then stalled. Advisors warned of ethical pitfalls, of re-traumatization, of backlash. Scripts were drafted and discarded. The project hovered in development hell, unable to reconcile the demand for tension with the obligation to restraint. Eventually, it was shelved. Not all stories want to be retold. Some resist adaptation by their very nature. In the neighborhood, subtle changes accumulated. A cafe replaced a hardware store. Murals appeared where blank walls once stood. The building associated with the crime underwent renovations, its facade softened by new paint and windows. To newcomers, it was just another address. To those who remembered, the changes felt both relieving and disorienting, like watching an old photograph slowly fade. A community organizer used the case as a starting point for conversations about trust, between residents and police, between neighbors, between institutions and the people they serve. Attendance was modest. Engagement was uneven, but the discussions were earnest. Participants spoke about fear without spectacle, about vigilance without paranoia. The organizer believed progress rarely announced itself. It accumulated quietly, like interest. Technology companies continued to refine genetic tools, marketing them with language that promised empowerment and discovery. Critics pushed back, citing cases like this one as evidence of unintended consequences. The debate grew more polarized. Privacy advocates warned of slippery slopes. Law enforcement praised breakthroughs. The public, caught between fascination and unease, consumed both narratives without fully committing to either. In a classroom, a teacher assigned an essay asking students to consider the phrase "case closed." One student wrote that closure was a myth, a linguistic convenience that disguised ongoing impact. Another argued that without closure, society could not function. The teacher graded generously, recognizing that the exercise was not about correctness but about perspective. Understanding, she knew, was not binary. The journalist who had once chased every update now watched developments from a distance. He had learned restraint the hard way. Sensationalism, he realized, was easy. Responsibility was not. When asked to comment on a related case, he declined, suggesting another reporter. He had said what he needed to say. Silence in his profession was a deliberate choice. For some investigators, the case altered their approach permanently. They became more patient, more skeptical, more willing to question assumptions. Others hardened, convinced that results justified rigor without reflection. Institutions absorbed both tendencies. Reform, like resistance, rarely moved in a straight line. The family visited the grave less often but thought of her more freely. Memory, no longer tethered to procedural milestones, expanded into everyday moments. They spoke her name without hesitation. They allowed joy without guilt. These small permissions felt radical. Survival, they discovered, required defiance of expectation. As debates continued and narratives shifted, the case settled into a paradoxical state. Resolved yet unresolved, finished yet ongoing. It had delivered answers while generating new questions. It had provided certainty while exposing fragility. It had closed a file but opened a conversation that refused to end. And in that tension between knowledge and doubt, between justice and its limits, the case found its lasting significance. Not as a headline or a verdict, but as a reminder that truth is rarely singular, and that even when silence breaks, echoes remain. In the end, what endured was not the verdict, not the technology, not even the story as it had been told and retold, but the quiet recalibration that followed, the the subtle shift in how people listened to silence. The city had learned something it could not easily articulate, that answers do not erase questions, and certainty does not banish unease. It simply rearranges it. The file was closed, stamped, and shelved, but the case lived elsewhere now, in habits and hesitations, in the way investigators paused an extra second before declaring confidence, in the way families measured hope against restraint. It lived in the institutional memory of departments that rarely acknowledged their own pasts, and in the private memory of individuals who carried fragments they would never share aloud. Years later, a new detective leafed through archived materials during a training rotation, scanning documents yellowed at the edges. She read about the early missteps, the stalled leads, the sudden breakthrough. What struck her was not the ingenuity but the waiting. The long stretches where nothing happened, where faith in the process had to substitute for evidence. She closed the folder slowly, understanding that patience was not passive, that endurance was a skill learned only through exposure to uncertainty. Outside the system, the public relationship with crime continued to oscillate between appetite and aversion. Headlines promised resolution. Podcasts offered intimacy. Audiences consumed stories of violence with the detachment of spectators, rarely confronting the residue left behind. This case, once emblematic of triumph, now surfaced in discussions as a warning. That fascination could eclipse empathy, that narratives could simplify what life refused to. The family watched these cultural shifts from a distance. They no longer felt compelled to correct inaccuracies or respond to speculation. Their silence was not resignation but boundary. They had reclaimed their story from the machinery that had processed it. What remained was theirs alone, imperfect and unfinished. On certain nights, one family member admitted, she still dreamed of unanswered questions. In the dreams, doors opened to hallways that stretched endlessly, each lined with photographs that blurred as she approached. She woke without fear, only with the familiar ache of incompleteness. She had learned to accept it. Some questions, she understood, were not meant to be solved but carried. The man in prison marked time through routines that dulled reflection. He stopped writing letters altogether. Words, he decided, were unreliable companions. Instead, he focused on the tangible, the weight of books, the rhythm of walking laps, the predictability of schedules. He avoided news of the outside world. Progress frightened him more than stagnation. It reminded him that life continued without his participation. For those who believed in his guilt, the case remained a validation of persistence. For those who doubted, it was an example of overreach. Between these positions lay a vast middle ground occupied by those who simply lived with the outcome, neither celebrating nor contesting it, but absorbing its implications quietly. Society, after all, does not move by consensus. It moves by accumulation. In academic circles, the case became shorthand, a reference point invoked without explanation. Students learned its outline before they learned its nuance. Professors cautioned against romanticizing delay or demonizing technology. They urged skepticism without cynicism, hope without naivety. The case served as both inspiration and restraint, a dual legacy that resisted reduction. The neighborhood where it all began continued its transformation. Children grew up unaware of the history beneath their feet. New residents painted walls, planted trees, built routines untouched by old fears. This was not forgetting. It was survival in its most ordinary form. Memory does not demand constant acknowledgement to remain real. An anniversary passed without media attention. No space chill serve. No think pieces circulated. The absence felt appropriate. The story had exhausted its public function. What remained was personal, diffuse, resistant to spectacle. Silence, once oppressive, had become neutral again. A former detective, now fully retired, encountered a young officer struggling with an unsolved case. He listened without offering solutions, recognizing the familiar strain. When the officer asked how he endured the waiting, the old detective paused. He said endurance was not about answers. It was about continuing to look without becoming consumed by the act of looking. The advice was unsatisfying. It was also true. The phrase cold case continued to evolve, stretched thin by usage. It suggested dormancy, a pause, a state awaiting reversal. This case had proven otherwise. Cold did not mean inactive. It meant preserved, waiting for the right conditions to react. Even then, reaction did not guarantee clarity. Sometimes it produced only change. In private moments, members of the family spoke about the person they had lost not as a victim but as a presence that shaped them. Her influence appeared in decisions made, paths chosen, resilience discovered. She was no longer confined to the circumstances of her death. She had been restored to the broader context of her life. As years layered upon years, the case receded into history without fully becoming past. It occupied a liminal space, neither immediate nor irrelevant. It reminded those who encountered it that justice was a process, not a proclamation, and that truth, once revealed, did not conclude its work. What remained most striking was how the silence at the center had changed. It was no longer the silence of absence, of unanswered phones and empty rooms. It was the silence that follows noise, the kind that settles after debate and decision, carrying with it a low, persistent hum. Not peace, but equilibrium. The city continued to breathe, to expand, to forget and remember in uneven measure. The institutions adjusted incrementally, learning and resisting in equal parts. Individuals carried forward what they could, set down what they could not. The case, once a rupture, had become a reference point, a reminder etched into collective awareness. And somewhere between resolution and doubt, between closure and continuation, the story found its final form. Not as a conclusion, but as a question that endured. A question about what it means to know, about what it costs to answer, and about the quiet spaces that remain when the headlines fade and the room goes still. The New York 1995 cold case was solved, the record would say. But beneath that line, unrecorded and unresolved, lay the deeper truth that silence, once broken, never fully disappears. It changes shape, it changes tone, but it remains, asking to be acknowledged, long after the last word has been spoken.